Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy. If you follow the channel, you'll know that Russia has severely restricted the amount of official data that it's releasing to the West. However, once a month, it does post official figures onto its website. Now, normally I would have made this video a couple of weeks ago because this data usually comes out around the 14th or the 15th each month. But for some reason, the data for January hasn't been posted until the end of February. There's been a delay of around 2 weeks, but we've now got that information. So in today's video, we'll go through the official numbers that have been posted by Russia. So anybody that fancies posting a note below saying you're making all of this up, stop talking rubbish, don't bother, because this is the official data. It's not my data. I'm not creating it. This is what Russia is wanting the world to see. And what we'll see from today's figures is that there continues to be a huge fall in oil and gas revenue compared to where Russia was before it invaded Ukraine. However, that fall in oil and gas revenue has been more than offset by a huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue. And these figures reflect the fact that Russia has moved away from being a capitalist economy to being a wartime economy. So there is now a huge focus going into the production of guns, equipment and machinery that's feeding the war in Ukraine. So we'll go through the details on all of those figures and talk about what that means for the Russian economy in the long term. We'll also have a look at what's happening with total revenue and expenditure, because expenditure is one of the key problems that the Russian economy has right now. Because it's moved to this wartime economy, it's spending an absolute fortune keeping the war in Ukraine going. And that means that Russia is still posting losses on a monthly basis. So overall, the economy is still running short of cash. So we'll go through all of the details that have been posted by the Russian Ministry of Finance. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think these figures indicate where Russia is sitting right now compared to where it was before this war started, and what the long-term implications are for the Russian economy if it continues operating in this manner. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you so much. Really appreciate those individual gestures. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, I really appreciate your long-term support, because all of the support that I'm getting helps me keep this channel going and posting more videos. Okay, so regular viewers will know that we're picking up this data from the Russian Ministry of Finance, but if you'd like to have a look at it yourself, type in minfin.gov.ru/EN, if you'd like to read it in English, /document, and it will take you to this page. And if you scroll down, the information that we're looking at today is shown in the document called Brief Monthly Information on Federal Budget Execution, cumulative from the beginning of the year in billions of rubles. And that was posted on the 27th of February 2024. So when you click into that document, you'll see that we've got lots of really detailed information for 2011. That gives us lots and lots of data. However, if you go down and scroll across so that we can see the latest data for 2024, you can see that there are quite a lot of blanks on this sheet. Russia has limited the amount of information it's now releasing. But we do have some key metrics in terms of oil and gas, non-oil and gas, lots of expenditure, and the net profit position, or the net loss as it is at the moment. And what I've done, rather than looking at this data, which is a bit dry and a bit boring, I've transposed all of these figures into a spreadsheet. So I've copied everything through and created some colourful graphs, because graphs are far more interesting to look at and also show us the trends, which is really important in terms of establishing exactly what's going on right now. So let's kick off by looking at what's happening with oil and gas revenue. This chart plots the cumulative movement in oil and gas revenues for Russia for 2021, 2022, 2023 and 2024. 21 is shown by the grey line at the top, 22 the orange line, which is the next one down, 23 the blue line, and 24 would be shown by the yellow line. However, as we've only got 1 month's worth of data for January, there isn't actually a line, because the whole point of having a graph is that you join up the dots for all of the different months to show what the trend is for the year. But obviously when you've only got one dot, you don't have any line at all, you just have a dot. And unfortunately you can't really make out the dot for January 2024 because it's caught up between all of the other January data. So in order to assess the data for January 2024, it will be easier to look at the table at the bottom. And what this shows is that in January 24, Russia earned 675 billion rubles, or around $7.5 billion from the sale of oil and gas, which represents a 59% increase against the official figure recorded for January 2023, a 15% fall against the figure for January 2022, and a 55% fall against the figure for January 2021. And as we've discussed previously, the figures for 2021 are actually the last year that was completely unaffected by the war in Ukraine. The figures for January 2022 had already started to be impacted by what was happening in Ukraine, because Russia was building up troops on the border, and as a result of that, the global markets were very nervous and the price of oil had jumped dramatically. So there was a concern that if Russia did invade Ukraine, it would have an impact on global oil supplies, and therefore prices started to go up, whereas 2021 was entirely unaffected. And when you look at the comparison between January 24 and January 21, a 55% reduction is absolutely huge. That is going to have an enormous impact on Russia's economy, because Russia is dependent on oil and gas sales. And as you'll know if you follow the channel, because of the sanctions that have been applied against Russia, Russia's gas sales have fallen dramatically. Prior to the war in Ukraine starting, it was supplying the majority of Europe with pipeline gas, which was the most efficient and cheapest way for all of those countries to buy it. So that was a great arrangement for everybody involved. However, because of the invasion of Ukraine, most of those European countries stopped buying all of that gas, and Russia has struggled to be able to sell it to alternative countries, because in order to sell it to countries like India, it would need to convert that gas into liquefied natural gas, put it onto ships, and then export it. However, it doesn't have the facilities to be able to do that. So the natural gas sales have fallen dramatically, and alongside that, Russia's income from oil sales have also fallen significantly. Firstly, as a result of the sanctions, which have limited the markets that Russia can sell into. Secondly, because of the discounts that Russia is having to offer to countries in order to encourage them to buy Russian oil. And thirdly, because oil prices today are lower than they were 2 years ago as a result of the fact that there was a spike in market prices at that time because of the war and the concerns around everything else. So the overall summary of the figures that we're seeing here is, despite the fact that Russia has posted a 59% year-on-year increase in oil and gas sales, when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture and assess what's going on here, Russia has lost a huge amount of income as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. And the month-on-month comparison between 24 and 2021 shows a 55% decline in oil and gas revenues. This chart plots the monthly movements in non-oil and gas revenue for 2021, 22, 23 and 24. And the colour scheme here is exactly the same as what we've just looked at. And the issue with regards to January only being 1 month's worth of data for 2024 means that we don't have a yellow line. But I think what's worth noting before we go into the details of what's happened in January is the fact that the lines on this chart are in the reverse order to what we've just seen for oil and gas revenue. When we looked at oil and gas, the year that had the most revenue was 2021, followed by 2022, and then 2023 was the year with the lowest amount of income. And that really reflects the fact that the sanctions have been kicking in and making it more difficult for Russia to be able to earn revenue, and also oil prices were generally higher in 2022 than they were in 2023. So even though Russia was having to sell at a discount, it was still earning a reasonable amount. However, if we look at what's happened with non-oil and gas revenue, it's the exact opposite. The year with the lowest amount of non-oil and gas revenue was 2021. The year with the second lowest was 2022. And the year with the highest non-oil and gas revenue was 2023. And the reason for that is that over the last 2 years, Russia has been changing to be a wartime economy. So it's been putting more effort and focus into producing military equipment and guns and armaments and things that are going into Ukraine. And that's helping the economy overall because the state is sponsoring all of those initiatives. So it's asking companies to stop doing what it was doing previously and to start making things that are needed for Ukraine. And in the short term, that provides a benefit because you're paying those companies. So those companies are earning healthy profits. They're making things for the state and everybody's busy. But when you think about the long-term implications of what Russia is doing, there isn't any real long-term prospects. Because if you compare this to investing into a new factory, which is going to produce things that are sold all around the world, you have the initial investment, you hire all of the people, there is a benefit in the short term in the same way as you get when you're investing into military equipment. But over the long term, that investment pays dividends because that factory will produce cars or washing machines or widgets or whatever it might be in the long term. And as it becomes more successful and exports things all around the world, that company may expand, it may open a second factory and produce even more equipment, and so it goes on. That's how business develops. However, when you're investing into things like defense equipment, you don't get that long-term benefit because if you're paying a company to produce bullets, for example, they might produce 1 million bullets a week, which is great, and they're getting paid for that. However, those bullets are then sent to Ukraine and used, and there is no long-term benefit. The bullets don't become self-fulfilling. They are not expanding through creating bullets. It's a one-time purchase made by the Russian government. And if the war in Ukraine stopped, then obviously there would no longer be any need for more bullets, and so all of that business would dry up immediately. And so although you have a short-term benefit in terms of showing all of that revenue, the long-term prospects are not good. If we now look at the results for January 2024, you can see that non-oil and gas revenue in the month was 1.7 trillion rubles, which equates to around 19 billion US dollars. And that represents an 85% increase against the non-oil and gas revenue for January 2023, a 33% increase against the same figure for 2022, and a whopping 251% increase against the non-oil and gas figures for 2021. And what this tells us is that over the last 3 years, non-oil and gas revenue has become more important to the Russian economy than oil and gas revenue. If we look at the comparative figures, in 2021, Russia earned $16.7 billion from oil and gas revenues and $5.5 billion from non-oil and gas revenues. So at that time, oil and gas revenue was around 3 times larger than non-oil and gas revenue. If we look at the figures for 2024, oil and gas revenue was $7.5 billion compared with $19.1 billion for non-oil and gas revenue. So basically 2/3 of the Russian income is now coming from non-oil and gas revenue. And that's as a result of the fact that the Russian authorities are sponsoring this revenue. They are paying people to produce things to go to Ukraine. Now that's driving up revenue, but as we've just discussed, it doesn't have any long-term benefits. This chart shows the movement in total revenue for the last 4 years. And once again, we can't really see the figures for January 2024 because it's just a single dot, but we'll come on to talk about that in a moment. But before we dive into that detail, I just wanted to look at where these 3 lines are sitting. And you can see that overall, Russian total revenue was the highest in 2021, and the figures for 2022 and 2023 were broadly similar. In January 2024, the official total revenue figure was 2.4 trillion rubles, which equates to around $26.6 billion. And that figure represents an increase of around 77% against the total revenue of 15 billion in 2023, an increase of 15% against total revenue of 23 billion in 2022, and an increase of 20% against total revenue for 2021 of 22 billion. So on paper, January 2024 was the best year that Russia has had out of the last 4 years. This is a record-breaking year. However, as we just discussed, the reason why total revenue is up against previous years is as a direct result of the enormous increase in non-oil and gas revenue, which is being driven by the Russian state sponsoring businesses to produce equipment to be sent to Ukraine. So this is basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. Russia wants to increase its revenue, so it hires more companies and pays them directly from the state to make things for the war in Ukraine. So when you take a step back and look at what's happening with the constituent parts of that total revenue, there has been an enormous fall in oil and gas revenue and a huge rise in wartime revenue. And in the long term, that will not benefit Russia. This chart shows the movement in total expenditure in Russia over the last 4 years, and we've got the same colour coding here. And what this shows is that the year with the most expenditure was 2023, followed by 2022, and then 2021 was the year with the least expenditure. And the reason for that is because this expenditure predominantly relates to what's going on in Ukraine. Russia has ramped up its defence spending over the last 3 years as it directs more and more energy and investment into the war in Ukraine. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that the Russian budget for 2024 includes a huge increase in defence spending. It's now representing more than 30% of total expenditure. And that's coming at the cost of things like education and healthcare, which aren't seeing any real increases at all. So Russia is really putting a lot of energy and a lot of investment into the war. And if we look at the expenditure figure for January 2024, the official figure was 2.7 trillion rubles, which equates to around $30 billion. And that figure represents a fall of around 10% against the figure for January 23, which is around $33 billion. However, was a 48% increase against the figure for 2022 of $20 billion, and a whopping 73% increase against the figure for 2021 of $17 billion. And to put the current level of expenditure into perspective, the $30 billion that Russia spent in January compares to the $26.6 billion of total revenue that it earned. So it's spending more than it's earning, and that is not a sustainable situation, because if you continue doing that, then you continue having to draw down on your reserves, and at some point they will run out. This chart shows the movement in net profit or net deficit, depending on whether it's a positive figure or a negative figure, for Russia for the last 4 years. And this chart has some interesting characteristics. The only year when Russia posted a net profit in every single month was 2021, where we saw a cumulative increase all the way through until November. However, December is the month when Russia passes a lot of its expenditure. It builds up cost and then puts it all through in the last month of the year. So you can see when you look at the grey line that there is a noticeable downturn in December. And that's the situation for every other year. And as a result of that large amount of cost being processed in December, in 2022, despite the fact that Russia posted a net profit in the first 11 months, the net outcome for the year was a loss of 3.3 trillion rubles, or around $37 billion. And then in 2023, Russia was in deficit in every single month. It posted a net loss in every month, and then in December, because of the large amount of cost that goes through in that month, the total year-end loss was again 3.3 trillion rubles, or around $37 billion. If we now look at the figures for January 24, the net position was a loss of 308 billion rubles, which equates to around $3.4 billion, which was an improvement against the loss of $18 billion incurred in January 2023. However, was significantly worse than the $2.8 billion of profit posted in January 2022. And the $4.8 billion posted in January 2021. And when you compare January 24 against January 21, it represents a net swing of $8.2 billion, going from profit to loss. And clearly, that isn't a good or sustainable situation from Russia's perspective. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's really important to look at the official figures that are being posted by the Russian Ministry of Finance. And that's what we've been through in today's video. These aren't my figures. Although those graphs are my graphs, I'm using the data provided by Russia. And what that data is telling us is really fascinating. It shows that oil and gas revenue is down significantly against where Russia was before this war started. In January 2024, compared with where Russia was in 2021, we saw a 55% fall in revenue. That is disastrous from Russia's point of view. More than half of the revenue being wiped out as a result of the sanctions and all of the measures that have been applied against Russia. And we've talked about this at length, so I won't go into all of the details from that point of view. But when your economy is entirely based on the export of certain items, you need to make sure that you're continuing to earn large amounts from those items. And what Russia is showing from its official data is that it's lost more than half of its revenue. That is a complete nightmare from Russia's point of view, because the oil and gas industry has a high fixed cost base. So basically, you have a lot of costs that are embedded. You have to pay a huge amount to put all of the drilling facilities in place, put all of the plant and equipment in place, hire all of the people, get all of the infrastructure ready to be able to cope with all of that oil as it comes out the ground, and then move it and transport it, put it onto ships. So there is a large amount of fixed cost. And once you've spent all of that fixed cost, you need to then make sure that you've got the maximum amount of flow coming out of the ground to keep everything moving and to start making money. And you'll make your margin on all of that product, and you can slowly start earning a profit. But if you see a reduction in your volumes, then that will hurt all of your margins and start reducing all of your profitability. And that's exactly what's happening with Russia right now. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the fact that Russia has now announced an outright ban for the next 6 months on all gasoline exports. And when you think about Russia being dependent on oil and gas exports, you would think, what are they doing? That is absolutely crazy to put a ban on your number one product. But the reason that they're doing that is they're now having shortages in their home market. They haven't got enough to feed all of their own consumers and agriculture. That's the official line. However, you have to think that there might actually be some production problems, that Russia isn't able to keep pumping the amount of oil that it was historically, and therefore it's having to cut back to cover the fact that there are issues happening right now, potentially to do with the loss of technology as a result of the sanctions, or maybe the loss of its business partners. Companies like BP, ExxonMobil and Shell all left Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. Or maybe it's down to other factors, that it just can't cope with the amount of volume that's coming through at the moment compared with what's happening with demand in the export markets. But whatever the reason, Russia has now cut back and it's banned all of those gasoline exports. And that is going to have a massive impact on its revenues over the next 6 months, because it won't have any revenue from all of those sales. But more importantly, there'll be a knock-on implication for all of the refineries in Russia. They've got 44 mega refineries, which are dependent on huge volumes of oil moving through them constantly. So if that volume isn't moving through them, there are question marks as to whether or not you can keep operating all of those refineries on a cost-effective basis. So there are a lot of things going on right now in Russia with the oil and gas industry. And what we've seen is a 55% fall in revenue in January. And over the next 6 months, we may well see that figure dropping even further as Russia has cut back on its exports and pressure starts to build. But what we saw from the other data was that non-oil and gas revenue used to represent around 25% of total revenue. However, today it's around 2/3. So Russia has moved away from being an oil and gas dependent economy and is now dependent on non-oil and gas revenue. And as we've discussed in today's video, the majority of that non-oil and gas revenue is being driven by initiatives put in place by the Russian authorities to provide more equipment and facilities for Ukraine to keep feeding the war. And that's pushing up revenue for a lot of those companies. They're being sponsored and paid to produce all of these things. But over the long term, this isn't going to benefit the Russian economy. What Russia has done over the last 30 years is build lots of different industries. It invited in multinationals such as car companies, those sort of initiatives, to build factories and help Russia to develop its own industries, to become self-sufficient. And once it got to the point where it was manufacturing a sufficient amount of vehicles, it could then start exporting them and earning money. And that's how you build your capitalist economy. But what Russia's doing today isn't that at all. It's not building its own industry, which is going to benefit from for the next 30 years. It's building things that are being sent to Ukraine that are never coming back. There are obviously more orders coming through from the Russian authorities who want more equipment. But if the war in Ukraine stopped tomorrow, then theoretically we would see all of those orders ceasing immediately. And that could mean that all of those businesses are illiquid. They could all go bankrupt. We could see the Russian economy implode if the war in Ukraine stopped. And I guess there are some negative issues around that potentially it's actually good news for Russia if the war carries on, because it can keep feeding itself, it can keep growing its GDP by paying all of these companies to keep producing equipment. And what that means from Russia's point of view is that there isn't really a strong incentive to stop the war right now. Until Russia sorts out its economic problems, it's likely that the war represents good news in terms of keep driving up that non-oil and gas revenue. But the other thing that we saw from today's data is that the expenditure on the war in Ukraine keeps going up. And what that means is that on a net basis, Russia continues to post losses. It posted a loss in every single month in 2023, and the first month of 2024, that trend has continued. And when you continually post losses, that means that you have to fund those losses from somewhere else. Russia is dipping into its national wealth fund. It's continuing to take cash out of that to pay for these losses. And at some point, if that situation continues, Russia will run out of cash. So it needs to start making more sales from oil and gas, things that are genuine products, genuine exports, where you're actually being paid for them, rather than just producing things for the war in Ukraine, which looks good on a balance sheet. It looks good when you post figures like we've seen today that you can show there's been a massive increase in non-oil and gas revenue. But actually, if you're funding all of that increase yourself, then it isn't real revenue. You're just paying yourself, so it looks good. But actually, the reality is there's no real cash coming from that. The cash is coming from the National Wealth Fund, and at some point, that fund will run dry if Russia carries on as it is right now. So the overall summary of today's video is what we've seen from the data for January shows that oil and gas revenue continues to fall. It's struggling because of all of the sanctions. Russia has offset that fall in oil and gas revenue by boosting its non-oil and gas revenues. However, on an overall basis, Russia is still posting a net loss. It's funding that loss from its reserves, and at some point, it needs to balance its books or it will run out of cash. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Here's something to put a smile on your face.